to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Urban Fae Troupe of the High Fae, Part 1 by Bearlair 64. I didn't know what to do. I held my Sorsha to me and rocked. I knew with absolute certainty that this could not be happening. I knew that somehow it had to be just some spell, some casting or glamour. At any minute I'd hear the tinkling of her laughter. Hands tentatively touched me. I ignored them. They weren't hers. Voices intruded on my madness. I refused to understand their words. The murmur of comfort and sympathy, the whisper of encouragement, none of it registered, only the awful void before me. One voice eventually reached me, impossibly. It was her. Put me in the water, my love. It's the only way. I peered through bleary, tear-stained eyes into those emerald orbs. They were open and regarded me with absolute love and a haunting pity. I eased her torture mass into the little waves that lapped at the shore. She slipped beneath them, sank into the dark depths without moving a muscle. I started to lunge into the water after her, but the hands, so many of them, restrained me. That took some doing. I'd always been strong, and in recent months I'd picked up some skills to go along with my muscle mass. The many hands held me strongly, but gently, and the voices helped hold me off the battle rage that would do no good. Another voice impinged on my senses, slowly at first, but then with more insistence. My lord, you must look into the waves of the water. That is where you will find what peace you may. I couldn't imagine that such a thing as peace ever existed. Surely the world had become nothing but ash and devastation. Look, my lord, it will help her. Her. I finally did as the voice urged. Out among the gentle chop, a head bobbed. Covered in red fur and large green eyes shone with pent-up physical pain and grief, yet regarded me with compassion. The seal looked well enough. For a moment my heart soared once more. She'd somehow found our miracle. She would recover, and we would once more be happy, and our love would consume our lives. Then I recalled something from the last time she'd been forced to transform. If it happened again, it would be permanent. The man who'd awakened me, the very one whom Sorsha had saved when he'd been so injured by the Bito Icho. Oshin was his name, now gazed at me in sympathy. My lord, she will remain as she is for the rest of her life. It would be best to take her back to Otherworld, to complete her healing process, and allow her to discover a way to live. She is too near the perilous portal and her enemies. We are her guardians. My wife, Niam, and I are all that are left. Clarion fell when the water boiled. We would be honored to carry her back with us while you attend to other concerns. We will care for her as before and see that she heals. I was too shattered to argue. I would have to leave her in the hands, flippers, of others for the time being. I continued to gaze at the sweet little red head that bobbed out from the shore. Then she was gone. A flipper waved in farewell as she dove. She must have known I'd be frozen until that moment. She'd always known me better than I knew myself. I nodded for Oshin's sake. I agree. I must confer with the general staff and determine how we fared. I had to throw myself completely into other tasks. I could not let myself feel anything. I sought out the cold, dark place that allowed me to live without a conscience among the savages of Mundania. I fled there and surrounded my heart with stone. We held much of our debriefing on the march. I strolled along in front of the chariot. Garen and the team had to swim the last part of their retreat. The team was amazing, and fortunately the chariot floated. Otherworld nature and all that. But I didn't care at the time. I saw Arthur Mayle, limping along, clearly suffering from some internal damage, but with the head of the serpent slung over one of his pouches, the golden glow still hovered around his head. He caught my eye and gave me a rueful grin. I won, but at the price of some stove in the ribs. My little friend saved my life. I comprehended then that the glow was from a swarm of wee folk, the little ones in the parking garage at Fulshire Tower. It crossed my mind to wonder what they could have done in such a contest, but the question kept going until it had crossed and passed from my mind. There were more important matters to discuss. Goodrich walked along on all fours. He kept his pace slow to match the rest of us. The airwolves got away unscathed. We left as soon as our mission was completed, as you ordered. I'm sorry, we had been there. I shook my head. Then we'll be mourning you and the rest of our flyers. Nothing short of another dragon could stop the thing. Maybe a guard missile or 3. I mumbled the last. You completed your task perfectly? I asked the last for a reason. I caught the feeling of satisfaction from him. Yes, the sacrificial subjects are alive, and we have them in tow. We were right. It hurt them more taking those who had been intended and prepared for the rites than to merely slay them along with the rest. I doubt it did them much good to lose their high priest either. No doubt Serpente is fuming along with his pet. I imagine his generals will suffer, perhaps provide the next sacrifice. Good, I gritted out coldly. The more they suffer, the better I will feel. It was a lie, or would have been had I faced the truth before I spoke. The fact was that nothing could make me feel better at that point. Shabil, I see that your team looks intact. How about your troops? I lost track when we turned to roll up their flanks. He nodded grimly. We lost 3 warriors and have several wounded. The soldiers on their side lost, but they were not without valor and skill. Roar, whose band had a line to either side and behind me, while the wolves ranged ahead, looked up at me. We lost one of ours, and we took all. And we all took wounds. Our medic, my kinswoman, Friday, saved the 2 most grievously wounded. They are riding with the wounded up ahead. We have done much to avenge our grief, but there is still much more to accomplish, and new grievances for which to seek redress. I nodded in approval. Declan, one of Grandfather's war leaders, spoke grim and hoarse-voiced. He'd have preferred to remain with his lord. The Western wolf warriors fared better than we could have hoped. The center of the line caved, and we split and turned to face the inner flanks we'd created, rather than push all the way through and into a potential trap. The slaughter was good. We'd lost 4 altogether, and we'll lose a few more of the long-lived who suffered grievous wounds. The rest will heal, provided we get them home soon. I just hope my lord did not suffer in our absence. I could only agree. I took the rest of the reports, and it turned out that we had another lopsided victory on our hands. It felt like utter defeat to me personally, yet we truly had scored a hit and proved that we were superior in quality to our enemies, if not quantity. Now we would have to stand down during the celebration of Samhain, which would be tonight and tomorrow night, the first anniversary of my run from the wild hunt. The year had been eventful, to say the least. I finally had to note my physical pain. No one had committed, but I had blisters on my exposed skin, and I'm sure I was red as a lobster under my armor and accoutrements. The army that entered the estate of the big bad wolf was weary and worn, but mostly ebullient. Survival did that for folk. Regardless of kind or form, they mourned their close friends and kin, yet deep down they guiltily rejoiced that they had not been among the slain. Tyree met us at the doorway to the hall. I could tell by my grandfather's features that someone had already delivered the news about Sorsha. He gave me a rare hug that was heartfelt and painful because of the burns, and I appreciated it somewhere just outside that stone lump that my heart had become. He'd certainly known his own share of grief and understood better than most how I felt. He stayed behind in the end to guard the portals near the care. There had been a counter-strike at the Crossroad portal for Centennial Park. It had been a strong effort, but foiled in the end. We left most of our archers, except for my fawn squad, to eat away at the resolve of any attackers. Friday gently applied ointment to my burns, and they'd already begun to heal in rapid method of Otherworld. She held my hand for a moment afterwards. We now shared a particularly awful form of grief. Later, as we sat in his private chambers, Tyree rumbled out, "I knew that Serpente was dangerous. I knew that there had to be a hidden power in his realm. I did not comprehend just how powerful. The Quetzal Dragon is likely one of his sisters, and thus loyal to the degree that any of their kind are. I should have realized." I looked up, puzzled. I know Otherworld is freaky. Are the Quetzal Dragons like griffins? Do they change at some point in their lives? He shook his head. No, they are the children of their god, the one of the high powers of their world. He takes on multiple forms and has different offspring from each form. Make no mistake, these foes combined are more powerful than both of us together. The thing was about 3 football fields or longer, I agreed. He knew what I meant. Otherworld had its equivalent games. I wasn't up to discussing the power of its UV fire. It even intimidated Goodwrench. We stared into the fire for some time, each sunk in his thoughts, a place that was untenable for me for long. Do we have to go to the High Court functions? I'm not sure I'll be able to contain myself if I see him. We must, he rumbled. However, you will not have only me to ward you and keep your enemies at bay. I looked up questioningly. A figure emerged from the shadows. Felix Mills. The sweet raven. She said nothing, just held me for a while, and then gazed up at me. I felt something brush against my knees, and my stone of a heart nearly cracked with startlement with a loud "meow" sounded, and glowing eyes stared up at me. Tom, still trying to give me heart failure. I bent and picked him up, regardless of his dignity. He allowed it, this once. He was also hurting. He'd loved Sorsha as much as he did anyone, and much more than he did any other 2 legs. We sat and had drinks. I poured some very nice wine into a dish for Tom. You get to speak again tomorrow evening. He gave me the empty cat stare, then replied, I can speak all the time in Otherworld. I felt pity for my feeble-minded emanation from his one and nearly laughed. Cats. Fithich smiled and chipped away at the stone. It's time for the dark-aligned powers to rise for their part of the year. I will be dancing since my great lady will be in ascendance in one of her aspects. However, we will remain at your side as often as our duty permits, and there will be others to guard you. Your great enemy will be there. He is a High Lord in most respects, the equivalent of a king. If not a popular one, he too will have allies toward him. The powers that are more neutrally aligned will create a sea of beings between the two of you. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Shabil. He came in without waiting for a response. When he saw Fidek and Tom, he halted and Nod bowed. "Your pardon, my lady and lord. I have urgent news to deliver." We all sat up in interest, and I handed him a cup of fine vintage. He gulped it, then handed out the glass for another. Once he was fortified, he continued, "We did a fair amount of harm to his Mundanian holdings. The dying dragon crushed the top floors, where many of the leaders were housed, all of them Fae. The compound still exists, but the central control is damaged, much the opposite of what we accomplished in our initial raid. Our Mundanian ordnance removed the dumpster gate and collapsed the connecting tunnel. Outside of taking down the 2 Quetzal dragons, our most effective hit was destroying the building atop which rested the portal that led to Starkavarm's lair. The portal now simply remains in the air above the rubble. The information we had on the exit was boondoggle, fed to our spies to mislead us. The fire drakes started a conflagration in the building, and our drones did the rest of the work. I don't think Serpente expected us to be effective. He has a large number of holdings, and it's hard to protect them all. He didn't think we'd do that in force. He expected small, hit-and-run engagements, like we'd resolved in council, when all were present. It was no surprise that we either had traitors or blabbermouths in our midst, and the inner circle had used the information to our advantage. It was cheering to know that we'd made some progress against a stronger enemy. I still had my personal feud with Serpente. It now included a pair of dragons that were far more dangerous than those we'd already destroyed. So any word on the otherworld results? I rebuilt some of the stone in my chest, just in case he said something that would otherwise hurt. Shabil grinned. "That one was the most effective hit. His folk are mostly slaves or live little better than slaves. They already dislike or even hate him. The raid on his border caused many to flee and run loose. Some turned outlaw or resistance fighter, depending on one perspective as usual. The damage to his prestige in snatching his prepared sacrifices was the great hit, that and wiping out over half of his soldiers at the Otherworld Pyramid Complex." I had to think for a moment, not easy with a heavy heart. Tyree said it first. "Over half?" He looked at me, surprise writ large on his face. Shabil's grin widened. "Yes. For all they were good and well-trained, the soldiers hadn't done anything but bully peasants and the downtrodden for many years. He had them decimated after we escaped. Let the Quetzal dragon fry and eat the unlucky in front of the survivors." He paused, and the grin slid immediately from his face. He feared that his exuberance he may have brought painful memories to my mind. He need not have worried. Those thoughts never left, just hid in the back of my brain and rattled and seethed, trapped inside the stone of my heart. Besides, I pictured members of Serpente's mob burning, not my Sorsha. I smiled and looked at Tyree. It was a hateful smile. The vitriol directed at another, but he recognized the emotion behind it and cocked his head questioningly. "Are the sacrificial offerings up to a party?" I asked. I dressed in all my Fae finery that evening. The soiree would be held at the High Court of the Powers of Darkness, and then there would be a troupe through otherworld, with a few stops on certain worlds in Mundania. My city was on the list this year. That information gave me that creepy crawly feeling in the pit of my stomach. Why not last year? I could have used the distraction. I'd asked Tyree, and he said that the Lord of the Hunt was there last year for the first part. This year, he would likely return only for the second part, if at all. It depended on the prey. On some level, I hoped to see him. If I did, though, it would mean that some poor slob had already been caught and gobbled by the hunt. At least it wouldn't be me. Donning the great plaid, the 6 yards of tartan material that had to be pleated, hung on with a belt, and then arranged was a welcome distraction. It was a garment unique to Scotland and Mundania, but common in otherworld, regardless of culture. I discovered that among the Fae, culture was more of a flavor than a district adherence to some ancient manner of dress and conduct. Aspects were more likely lent to Mundanians and adopted from their habits, manners, customs, and costumes. Once more I was slightly baffled when I tried to work out which traditions were hidebound and which were light suggestions. I carried my short sword on my right side and the claw on the left. I wore a sporran-style pouch in front. It was made of wolf fur. The entire thing seemed a bit gaudy, but I liked the pocket that the belted plaid made on my right. I put in my shield and a couple of items I'd picked up from the battlefield just in case. I'd grown very fond of otherworld storage spaces. The others, of course, looked resplendent. Everyone who was going did. Those who stayed in Wolf Castle were dressed for ceremony and fun. I was able to take 2 attendants rather than risk the feeling of any of my close company. I chose the 2 sacrificial victims, Juan and Maria. They had been drugged to the eyelids when we captured them. Well, rescued them. They didn't know one another. They'd been selected from among a large group of prisoners for their youth and fine features and bearing. We did not glamour them. They would be our guests in Otherworld for a year and a day. O-time, 7 to 9 years. M-time, we fed them and ensured that proper spells were set upon the food. By the time they returned, if they did, maybe the mortal authorities, figures, would have fixed a few things and put a stop to the 21st century slave trade that had landed in Serpente's clutches. I greeted them and clasped their hands in turn. They were educated in Spanish, in which I was fluent. In Otherworld, it didn't always matter unless one wished to express a word in a specific language. Due to the nature of the place, we were able to communicate clearly. I gave them the short version. You are in a strange place. There will be many strange beings, folks, and creatures where we are going. It may seem overwhelming, but stay close to me and do not stray. Our enemies will be there, but the bands of peace are on the event, so there will be no quarrel. If anything goes wrong, I will do everything I can to save you. Juan looked abashed and glanced first at the floor and then at Maria, and finally brought his eyes up to mine. We are grateful for your kindness, but this is very confusing. Where are we? Is this the land of the dead? I shrugged. Otherworld. It's a place where many worlds meet, like an international airport in a diverse city. Much of it is a place of life, but it is often a dangerous place that is also full of wonder and darkness and death. Once we get some things settled, and if you like, I will take you with me on some of my journeys. You will see sights beyond any imagining. When you return home, you won't remember them exactly, but you will always feel them, and the lessons you learn will be part of who you are. For tonight, I must request that you keep your questions to a minimum. You will learn much just by observing. I didn't get into the clause about if they returned home, if they fit in well and desired it, they could join the long-lived. The year and a day were a type of probation with all of the health benefits. For my part, I'd always avoided probation, court-ordered or employment-related. For a moment, I was comforted by the humorous thoughts that leapt to my mind. It wasn't much, but it meant I still had a means of holding back the horrors. So quoth this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.